Jeff, it's incredible to have you here.
Thanks, John.
So I've heard a lot about you.
Uh-oh.
Let me.
None of it is true.
You were one of the very first people to come out and support then candidate Trump. At a time when it, even among the conservatives, it wasn't cool yet, I think.
Oh, absolutely. I can tell you with certainty, I wrote my first column, Never Ignore Donald Trump, in June of 2013. And of course, all of my friends thought I was insane. And we went on from there. So, the thing was, I had worked for President Reagan.
Right.
And I remember when I was starting out in politics, I went to the 1976 Republican convention, which was the famous Ford-Reagan showdown. And my Pennsylvania political elders in the Republican Party were telling me why we all had to support Gerald Ford, because Ronald Reagan could never win Pennsylvania. He was too conservative and all of this kind of thing. So they nominate Ford, and he loses. He loses Pennsylvania, he loses the election. 4 years later, they were saying the same thing about George H.W. Bush, and this time Ronald Reagan won. And of course, in the fall, he not only carried Pennsylvania in a landslide, he carried another 42 states after that.
Yes, indeed.
And 4 years later, he carried Pennsylvania again and another 48 states. And 4 years after that, he campaigned all over in Pennsylvania for George H.W. Bush, who carried Pennsylvania. And then sort of my moderate Republican friends sort of took the party in another direction. And from that day until November of 2016, a Republican presidential candidate never won Pennsylvania again. And I really believe that Donald Trump had a Reagan-like appeal to working folks, blue-collar people, Democrats, even in the minority community to some degree, that he was in many ways the blue-collar billionaire.
Right.
Is sort of the way it comes up. And as I got to know him, I remember the first time that I met him, we went from Trump Tower to LaGuardia to fly to Washington for an event. And as we're going over the East River, he turns back and I'm looking and I'm seeing the United Nations, but there's this tall glistening tower next to it. And he says, that one's mine. Well, he uses as the kickoff to say, because we were then entering Queens, to talk about his father and, the sort of background and the time he'd spent with construction workers and all this as a kid. And, then his father said, don't go into Manhattan real estate we're Trumps and we belong in Queens and all this sort of thing. And he made bold to rent an apartment, print out a card that said the Trump Organization, and he was the only one in it. But it was a testament to me of his appeal, what I was certain would be his appeal to blue-collar voters, to Democrats. And as it came about, just like Ronald Reagan, that proved to be exactly the case. So when I, on occasion, go to Trump rallies and talk to people, I mean, these are regular folks, people who hadn't voted in a long time, or in some cases hadn't bothered to vote at all. And they came out specifically.
Because they were disillusioned?
They were disillusioned. They didn't like the candidates. They thought the Republican candidates were, not to their liking and not very appealing to them. Donald Trump, on the other hand, really struck a chord. I remember one woman had worked for a good bit of her career at Hershey, at the Hershey Company. And her job literally went to Mexico. She was not a happy camper. She'd worked there for decades. She was at
a lot of those stories in America.
Oh, yeah. And she was at one of those Trump rallies and was quite determined about all of this. And, just my political sense, you replicate this over and over and over, and you've got a candidate with a serious base that really is going to stick with it.
It's very interesting. And, I know a lot of conservatives at the time, especially early in the campaign, before the nomination and so forth, were really saying, this guy's a wolf in sheep's clothing or something, or I don't even know if they were saying that.
They were.
A wolf in wolf's clothing.
Right. Well, he's the first candidate to be elected directly from the private sector. And in the rough and tumble of New York real estate, you're dealing, let's face it, with a liberal left-of-center political machinery, whether it's run in City Hall or whether it's state government or what have you. And so, therefore, if you want to be a businessman of any sort of success and make your political contributions and all that kind of thing, you're going to go as his did to Hillary Clinton and Chuck Schumer and that sort of thing. But there's a difference between that and somebody when you're out on your own as a political candidate. And just in talking to him myself over time from 2013 on, I mean, I was totally convinced he was the real deal here. That, when you listen to him get passionate about trade with China,
right?
When you listen to him talk about illegal immigration, I mean, he was dead on serious about these things.
Right.
And I thought, because I had moved home from Washington, where I'd lived for a long time, to Pennsylvania to take care of senior parents. So I'm back in the real world, as it were. And it's not that these people were talking to me about Donald Trump, but they were talking to me about illegal immigration, Obamacare, their struggles with Obamacare, trade, as I said, that sort of thing. And I began to think, if this force over here ever meets up with this force over here,
wow, we're going to have something.
You could have a pretty considerable political explosion, and that is more or less what happened.
It reminds me a little bit, actually. I saw Selena Zito wandering around, a little bit about what she was thinking when she was out there, and the book she ended up writing.
Yeah, that's a great book. I mean, and I've known Selena for a long time. She really gets to the grassroots as a journalist and travels around and talks to folks.
She was one of the journalists I was actually following.
That's right.
During the campaign for that reason.
And I can tell you a couple CNN anecdotes, if you will. The Halloween weekend before the 2016 election, I was then taking care of my 97-year-old mom. It's a Saturday. I didn't have to be on CNN.
Good genes.
And right. So I said, Mom, it's Saturday. We're going to go get a pumpkin. So I get her in the car, and we head out into the Pennsylvania countryside.
You're going pumpkin picking with your 97-year-old mother.
Well, we went to a farm stand.
That's a good story in itself. Please continue.
We went to a farm stand, but suddenly I began to notice there were Trump signs everywhere. One guy had even painted Trump on the side of his barn.
Yeah. I heard about cows, actually.
So I'm starting to count now. Hundreds of these things, and I count one Hillary sign. So, okay.
And where was this again?
This is in suburban Harrisburg.
Okay.
And going out into the rural countryside there. And so I get back to New York on Monday, and I'm on with Anderson Cooper and my CNN friends, and I tell this story. And they said very sagely, Jeff, the polling data. And I said, guys, I'm just telling you, these signs are in people's yards. It's not like some party worker.
It's not like someone put these in.
Highway.
People are putting these up themselves.
They're putting them up in their yards. I said, I'm telling you, this means something. And then the night before the election, we were in a break on air because Hillary Clinton was doing her last rally in Philadelphia at Independence Hall, and there were thousands of people there, and she opened with John Bon Jovi and Bruce Springsteen, and then Chelsea, Bill Clinton, Mrs. Obama, President Obama, and then Hillary. So they go through all this, and it looked beautiful on television, I got to say that, but there was something else going on here. So when we got down, and my friends are going on about how wonderful this is, the first woman president will succeed the first black president, and they get to me and I said, look, this is Pennsylvania. And Philadelphia has always been viewed, as like the bullying older brother, if you will, by the entire Commonwealth of Pennsylvania throughout the history of Pennsylvania.
Right.
So what you've got here, and you send this television image all over Pennsylvania, are a bunch of rich rock and roll stars with a bunch of a rich ex-president and his daughter, and the wife who became rich doing all this, and President Obama, who's going to get all these book contracts and all this. What this looks like is rich insiders telling the rest of the plebes in Pennsylvania how they're going to vote. I said, I come from an area of Pennsylvania where this is not going to play. And when you go further west than me, this is definitely not going to play. We get to election night, and finally the results come in, and later I looked at the red and blue map, if you will, of the 67 counties in Pennsylvania. There were 11 counties that voted for Hillary. 56 of them voted for Donald Trump. And yeah, she carried Philadelphia, which
Especially
has a
the
lot
West,
of votes.
obviously. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But by adding up all of these smaller counties, Trump was able to defeat it. And I said to somebody later, Hillary's closing rally should have been in Harrisburg or Pittsburgh or Erie. But this is what she chose to do, and I think it was a misreading. And it's that kind of mentality that I think is always going on here, where all these people in the bubble, as it were, of Washington and New York just don't get the rest of the country.
So, okay, we're 2 years away from 2020. There's been 2 years of an upheaval in, American foreign policy, total shift in gears. Maybe upheaval is not the right word. Totally shifting gears. A lot of change, a lot of growth, economically, foreign policy, dramatic shifts. Where's the president's scorecard in your view, based on what you signed up for today?
I think he's doing great. I mean, you look at this summit here. I just finished writing a column that'll run tomorrow in Newsbusters. I was in the Reagan White House when Reagan went to Reykjavik. And, I was in the political office. And it irritated us that he had to go. This was a last-minute Gorbachev, request. And it irritated us because we were in the middle of the fall campaign, the last set of midterms for him, and we were doing our best to hold on to the Republican Senate that had been elected 6 years earlier. So the president was on the campaign trail. Well, to do this, of course, we had to pull him off. So he goes to Reykjavik, has this summit. All of a sudden it picks up steam, and they think they're going to cut all these nuclear missiles and all of this sort of thing. And at the very tail end, Gorbachev says, but not unless you cut back on the strategic defense and eliminate it or cut the research, which Reagan was unwilling to do.
Right.
So the whole thing ends. Reagan literally picks up his papers and says, let's go. And there's a famous picture of him coming out of, I think it was called Odie House, which is like a schoolhouse, with Gorbachev. And the look on Reagan's face, I mean, he was furious. He was furious. And they get to the car, and Gorbachev shakes his hand and says, I don't know what more I could have done. And Reagan says, you could have said yes. So the political effect.
This reminds me of something from a few days ago, perhaps, right?
That's my point, exactly. The immediate political impact was all of these headlines, Reagan fails. Well, history records that a little over a year later, Gorbachev had given in on SDI. I was there at the White House when Gorbachev came to visit and signed the treaty that eliminated a whole class of nuclear weapons, as I recall it. And then a few years after that, the Soviet Union collapses. So you look back and history records that Reykjavik summit as a great success. My point is, it is way too early to repeat that same mistake.
Right.
Because what happened when Reagan left that building is that the two teams kept at it, of course, for another year.
Right.
And I guarantee you...
Well, and he drew some lines.
Yes,
you
yes.
know?
And I guarantee you that Trump has got his people working still with the North Koreans. I mean, this is a very persistent guy. He doesn't take no for an answer.
I don't think anyone on any side of any spectrum would dispute this point.
Right, exactly. So, he wrote a book that I have called Never Give Up.
Right.
And he's deadly serious about this.
I have to read that one. I've read a number of the other ones. I have to read that one.
You have to read that one.
Yeah.
And, when you apply what's in there to what you're seeing now, it is very instructive for people who want to pay attention. So the media is doing the same thing. There is one difference, though, that works in Trump's favor. If you notice, when he came out of that meeting, the person he sat down for an hour with or whatever was Sean Hannity of Fox News.
Right.
Fox News didn't exist in 1986, and Sean Hannity wasn't there. There was no Rush Limbaugh. There was no conservative media. It just simply was non-existent. So the notion that Reagan failed was sold to the American people by ABC, CBS, NBC, and I guess CNN was there in its infant stage at that point. But now you've got this whole...
There are some other voices
right.
saying different
exactly.
sides of the story, let's say.
Exactly right.
Yeah. So, including the Epoch Times. Yeah.
So that's right. So exactly why. So, it's good. Literally, it is good that you're here. for this, because this is how we in this 21st century communicate the conservative message. I mean, you've got to do it. Social media and Twitter and all of the rest.
Jeff, it's unbelievable to speak with you. I wish I could speak with you for another few hours, but I know we'll all...
You'll fall asleep.
Such a pleasure, yeah.
Jan, thank you very much. I appreciate it.